Greetings and Merry Christmas. After taking a short break from podcasting, I'm very excited for this new episode of WPI Perspectives. My guest today is lauravandervos, a Catholic podcaster, musician, wife, mother of four, and founder of tradrecovery.com, a website for former traditionalists to find resources and support. I'm very excited for this discussion because I think Laura does some very important work that is so necessary in our church. She helps former radical traditionalists find their footing and a place in the wider Catholic Church. So welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be on.
So I first discovered you when your YouTube channel, which is called Misshappycatholic. So I guess that means you started it before you were married and had 4 kids.
Yeah.
It popped up in my recommendations a few months ago. And I remember watching you have a discussion with a young mother named Bethany, who had been raised in the SSPX. And the two of you talked about sort of the culture and the beliefs that she grew up with, some of the toxicity and judgmentalism and purity culture. And then the story of how she transitioned into the wider Catholic Church. And so since then, I've watched other videos on Misshappycatholic on YouTube. And one of them recently was an interview with a former, well, she's still a nun, but she is a former sedevacantist nun, which means that she was part of a community that didn't believe that any of the popes since 1958 are valid. So I've personally found your channel very fascinating, and I like the way that you share the stories of people's faith. So in this podcast, I'd like to kind of turn the tables on you and talk to you about your own personal journey, your own personal faith. And so maybe you could start by sharing just maybe a little bit about your faith upbringing. I understand you were raised Catholic and you were raised in a devout family or raised to think very seriously about your faith. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, your family of origin, how your faith started to grow.
So my parents are both cradle Catholics as well. My dad had gone to Catholic schools, but like during the 60s, 70s, things were getting kind of weird. So he would talk about the nuns, but we were like, oh, like imagining full habit nuns. And one day we were looking through photo albums and saw a picture of the nuns. And we were like, wow, those are like 60s fashion plates. Like I would never have known those were nuns. Oh, well, that could explain why many of your siblings did not retain their faith, but he managed to. His parents did too their whole life and prayed for their kids to come back. And some of them have. And so that's great. And my mom, her mom was very devout, and she tried to catechize the kids as well as she could. But just the world kind of gets to you sometimes. So they had a little bit of a rocky start, but they found each other. Their meeting story was great. They got married. They had 4 kids. So I'm the third girl. And then there's a boy after me and 12 years younger than me. So there was a big gap, but then I got to be a little mother. So that was fun.
Yeah.
And I mean, my parents just made basically everything in our lives revolve around faith, not in like a life-sucking way. We did a lot of family praying. We did the Liturgy of the Hours for many years together, kind of made our day revolve around that. So, we'd pray at certain times, certain things. And so that was actually really cool. My mom was really the catalyst behind that, but it was just a grace. We were all really able to be faithful to that, and it enriched our family life so much. So then I did consider religious life when I was a teenager, but I discerned that I was actually called to the married state. And then when I was 22, I met my husband and we got married and had our 4 kids so far, and we'll see how many more. So, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was thinking you're saying you're one of 4 and you have 4. I'm one of 4. I have 4, but you could wind up with 8 or 16 still.
Oh man,
you're still young.
Oh God help me. I've always wanted 8 kids, so we'll see if it happens. I guess I have time, but
it can. I have a friend who just had her 8th, so that's
cool.
Hi Melinda.
So
So and I assume that you went to the diocesan parish and
oh yes,
and
we were
raised...
always basically we've always been in diocesan parishes and didn't even encounter the TLM. I don't really like calling it that. I'll call it the 1962 because that's really official. We didn't encounter that till I was like 15. And we were kind of taken with it. At first we thought it was kind of weird. And then we were like, wow, maybe this is cool. And we're like very whole hog. We're like the last to leave a party. We do everything to the extreme because we just milk everything for what it's worth. Because it's like, this is important stuff. So we kind of just dove right into all that. And we met this fraternity priest. First, we'd listened to a lot of FSSP sermons online and stuff. And one of these priests we ended up meeting and getting to know. And we asked him to be our family spiritual director. So he would call once a month and talk to each of us individually. And that went on for years. And I learned a lot of really good stuff from him. He is a very humble man. But I didn't realize at the time, like I was so taken with just sort of this new angle of the Catholic experience that I hadn't encountered completely before in my life. And I was just infatuated with it and infatuated with this priest. And I was just like, oh, everything he says is like, you know, the word of God. So I really leaned heavily on him. I would ask him about all kinds of stuff. Is this okay? Is that okay? What book should I read about this? And I probably drove him crazy. You know, he didn't tell me to be like that, but I just was. And, but he was used to, now I understand, he was used to dealing with people like that all the time because he was a fraternity priest. And that's very much how many traditionalists are. It's like, oh, Father, Father, Father. And, so I wasn't really maturing in my faith as I should have been. And also some of the influences that I picked up from him as a result of his own formation had been slanted and caused me to distrust certain things that the church officially promoted, and also to be ungrateful for things that had nourished me spiritually my whole life, that now I was looking at like this snooty, knowing better elitist Catholic going, oh, well, that was okay when I didn't know better, but now I've got something better. And I just started to kind of get a little cold and hard and judgmental. And I didn't realize so much what was happening to me. Just, I mean, I've always liked rules and like boxes and things, you know, like categorizing. And so the Phariseeism, it's already something I tend to, and that was just kind of running wild with me when I was in traditionalism. And again, I never was actually part of like the SSPX or Sedevacantist, but I do have friends still in the society because we have a chapel close to us. And so I met a lot of people through a book group that were going there, and I still know some of them, met some more. And so, yeah, I actively have friends in the society. And I know other people that have, you know, passed in and out of my life who really got me into this work was my brother-in-law, who came out of the society, and getting to know him and his story and watching him transform into like how hard of a time he'd had coming out, and then how he just was so joyful and peaceful and reasonable. And then watching him interact with people who were still enmeshed in the SSPX world, and just marveling at the contrast and realizing that I was turning into being more like them and being very like bitter and kind of rabid. And he was just so peaceful and steady and kind. And I was like, wow, what am I becoming? What am I turning into? And it really kind of burned me. And I realized that it wasn't a good direction, and that I was actually going off course. So that kind of was a wake up call and brought me back. So about 7 years, I was probably really trad, and then sort of backed away. And I kind of needed a little space for a while to just sort of detox from it, because I realized it wasn't having ultimately the best effect on me. And then started coming into contact with these people, especially through my brother-in-law, and realizing the situation that we have and the need for people to have support and get their stories out there so that other people can learn from them, and also understand they're not alone, that they have someone they can relate to. And that's huge, because a lot of people feel very isolated, and we're trying to, you know, kind of remediate that.
My upbringing was a little bit different in that we never became Latin Mass Catholics per se, but a lot of those ideas, like my grandfather, for example, who was very influential on my upbringing and my faith, they lived 2 blocks away, but I think he was traumatized by Vatican II. Previously, he wasn't a huge, I guess, outspoken reader of, you know, Catholic publications, pontificate about what the Mass was supposed to be and all that kind of thing. But I mean, it's kind of a funny story, because where we are, just outside of Washington, D.C., there are probably 7 Catholic churches within a 15-minute drive of where I'm sitting right now. Yeah. And my grandfather was so traditional that it never occurred to him that he could maybe go to a parish outside the boundaries of the one that he lived in. And it just so happened that that was the one parish that was breaking all the rules. And, you know, things like homemade invalid matter at Mass, liturgical dancers. They allowed altar girls before anyone did. They allowed extraordinary ministers of communion before anyone did. The priest would preach from liberal theologians like Hans Kung and things like that. And so it's funny because my mom's experience was, she was a teenager at the time, and she would hear him. They would go to mass, and they were like the one family that was kneeling at the consecration, and they would come home, and then he would just complain about the mass and write a letter to the archbishop afterwards. And so my mom, after she got married, my dad converted, and the two of them went to a different parish. And I think my upbringing was maybe a little bit less of that anger towards the church, but we still did have some of those distinguishing qualities that were like, we know it, we're doing it right. We were like that family that received communion on the tongue, and that was like the first to sign up for the pro-life whatever, or I went to Catholic school, so I'm like in 8th grade, I'm correcting the religion teacher about how the anointing of the sick should be called extreme unction. That's its real name, like things like that. And I think, and I don't know if this is particularly American, but I think, and I can hear this in what you're saying, I can hear this in talking about how the people that you interact with the church, the sense of being part of a universal communion, and being part of a faith with a living magisterium and with a hierarchy, is almost lost on us. It's like orthodoxy is this picture that we paint, and it's not being in step in communion with the church and docile to the magisterium and respectful of our bishops. We would get publications that would bash the bishops, which, I mean, granted, there are a lot of bad bishops out there, but I don't think it's, in retrospect, some of it was just implementing Vatican II. It wasn't heterodoxy. It wasn't, but because people have this mix of experiences with untrustworthy teachers, or like that parish that my grandfather belonged to, or if something maybe sounds wishy-washy to them or sounds slightly easier than it used to be in the olden days, they get the impression that the harder, grouchier, for lack of a better word, form is Catholicism. And they don't seem to realize that the Catholic faith is much more rich and diverse, and it's supposed to be a source of joy, and it's supposed to make you want to love other people, not think badly of them because of what they're wearing or something like that. Did your husband have a background in traditionalism, or did you journey on this together, or did he help you?
Actually did not. He was raised by, his mother was Catholic, his dad was Calvinist. And so they had to go to both every Sunday until they were old, like 18. And then they decided they would be confirmed or become Calvinist. And he decided to be Catholic and confirmed, and then stopped going to the Protestant church too. So it's very interesting. And honestly, there are some real parallels between Calvinism and traditionalism. I mean, Protestantism in general, honestly, it's just sort of like with Catholic themes stuck on, but it's really in many ways the same. And so he hadn't been through all that, and he'd never been to a Latin Mass, so I was like, hey, why don't you meet us for the monthly diocesan Latin Mass? And, we're going to go down there and sing. And so, because he didn't live where I lived, we met at our cathedral. And so it was like halfway between us. So he drove and he went to that, and he was like, oh, okay. Yeah. He just never was really like taken by it the way I had been, which was okay, because he's also a lot more just stable in general. I'm kind of the loose cannon. So it's been really great to have him while I'm doing all these things and processing, talking to these people, because he doesn't really have a dog in the fight, but he just wants to really be Catholic, and he wants to give everybody credit for their perspective. So he helps me really give people the benefit of the doubt, but or he'll just sit there and be like, that's weird. Like, that's not Catholic. I'm like, yeah, I know. It's So it's been really good to have him there as a support. I mean, so many of the things I do, I could not do without him there. So even though he's not on the screen.
Within the Calvinism, I think there's that root of fundamentalism. And I think that's, you just see the parallels. It's like, instead of Bible alone, that it's Council of Trent alone, or tradition alone, or Lefebvre alone, or something like that. It's rather than looking at a stagnant, or rather than looking at a living tradition that carries on, and addresses the problems of the modern world and finds new ways to adapt. Yeah, it's got to be this way. It's fixed. This is the only way it can ever be interpreted, and that's that. And if there's a contradiction, you know,
Ooh.
even if the Pope says it's a continuity or the bishop says it's continuity, there's
right.
Yeah, we've got to point out that, well, this isn't, A isn't exactly the same as B, so it's a rupture. So that's a very popular view.
Right.
So what were the key motivations then behind starting your YouTube channel?
Well, like you said, I'd had it for a while, so it was there, and I put some videos on it, and I thought, oh, you know, I was doing research because of my friends in the society that I had gotten to know around that time. We were close, and we were starting to have conversations about why the SSPX, you know, why the Novus Ordo. And I was like, well, you know what? If they have something that I should have, I need to find out. I'm going to get to the bottom of it. So I just went to school on it, was doing all this research, finding articles and different things, quotes from the popes and stuff. And I thought, wow, this totally debunks it. I couldn't possibly consider going to the society now because I know beyond a doubt that's not truly where the Catholic Church is. So I thought, my friends weren't really ready to have all those discussions though, but I had all this stuff that I'd found. So I was like, well, somebody would benefit from hearing this. So I'm going to read it out loud and put it on my channel as videos, because then people can listen in the car or whatever. Cause I do that, obviously. I don't have a lot of time to sit around and read books, much as I would like to. So I definitely do a lot of that. And so I started doing that. And then Andrew Bartel had been around the internet, and he and I already knew each other. So we were talking, and I said, you know, he's like, I have some things I'd like to talk about, but nobody's really gotten into them with me. Maybe you and I should do a video together, and we could talk about these things, and like this angle of like the family and schism and his experience. And I was like, yeah, I'd love to do that. And so we did our 2-part interview talking about schism in the family. And that kind of started it. And then it just was like, I would just think of other people, like, maybe we should do a video and you can tell your story. And I always just loved stories, because I think it's the best way of telling, communicating principles and ideas. And I mean, our Lord used them all the time, parables. Yeah. And so it really sticks in your mind, and it means something to you. It's very personal and memorable. And so I thought, you know, this is what I love. I had written a book a few years back. It would just be full of stories about people and real people and just delightful things and interesting things. And so that's kind of how that format started on my channel, was interviews. And because I live close to a parish that has a kind of big traditionalist base, or ex-trad base, so I was getting to know a lot of those people, and some of them were sharing with me, and I was like, hey, would you want to do a video? And, you know, so a lot of it started locally, and then people in my YouTube comments or would reach out to me through email, and I would get to know them, and I'd be like, I think your story should be shared. And it was just so cool how it grew. And it's like, I literally have friends like all over the world now that I didn't know before this happened.
And what I really enjoy about your channel is the stories, because I mean, people like me and people like Michael Lofton or Dom Dalmaso, it's like, we're wonks. You know, we're the nerds that like to pick through this magisterial document and this one contradict what you say. So here's your claim. And it's like, but one of the things that I have learned is that 99% of the Catholics in the world don't think the way I do. You know, I think that the work we do is important in that it's there and it's available. And if people have concrete questions about it, they can go somewhere and find those resources. And one thing that we might talk about it a little bit on from here is trolls and comments and the resistance that you get for the basic fact that you exist and are trying to address these issues. I mean, to me, so like my journey kind of started when, so I just happened to be, well, I mean, I had my own journey through Pope Benedict that put me right on the doorstep of Francis's papacy, where I had learned to accept, papal primacy. I had learned to accept Vatican II. I had learned to accept these doctrines of, Pastor Eternus and all of these things. And then all of a sudden, Francis gets elected, and I'm hanging out with all these JP2 Catholics, and we've got Ratzinger book clubs, and we're all into, and I'm like, wow, I finally caught up to the church. And then Pope Francis becomes Pope, and all of my friends decide they hate the Pope, and it's like, so it was kind of this it was almost like, oh my goodness. And I can understand criticism. Believe me, it's like there are prudential issues, but then there's the magisterium. And I can understand if you don't like the Pope's style, if you think something could have been worded better, if you think he should have explained this better, if you think that he shouldn't have taught this when he taught that. That's natural. We're all human. Every Pope is different. Every Pope, you're not going to like all of them. There's a saying, the fat Pope follows the thin Pope. Like, that's just the way it works.
It's so cute.
But the thing is, it's like, here I'm trying to test out my new like fidelity to the Pope skills, and people are like, sharing with me things by radical traditionalists about how they got it right, and so that was a little bit disillusioning. And then I was working at the USCCB when he was elected, so I was in a position where I basically had to read everything that he put out for the first solid 2 years of his papacy. And I was laying out books. So I laid out the USCCB published edition of Evangelii Gaudium, for example, and so I'm trying not to read it as I'm quickly laying it out to get it to the publisher. And I can understand this isn't what a lot of Catholics are. It's not a requirement. It doesn't make you more holy if you've read every papal document. But to me, I'm kind of seeing things from his perspective. I'm seeing this openness, this let me listen to your entire story and see where you are and where can we work from there? What can I learn from you, even if we don't agree? And so by the time Amoris Laetitia came around, I'm in the trenches, fighting with people on Twitter over whether the Pope is the false prophet or not. And so that's where Peter is starting. So you started this channel.
Yes.
And you're talking to these people who are undergoing this journey. So how has the reaction been? I mean, you get comments from people, and you eventually start Trad Recovery, I assume, came after the interviews. And how did that come about?
Oh, well, Trad Recovery was the result of, I don't know if you know Hallelujah. She's all over YouTube, and she moderates for a lot of channels, Catholic channels.
Okay.
And so she would be on usually every time I was doing a video, she would be in there on the chat, and she started asking, is there some kind of support group for people like this that have left and, are processing? And I was like, I don't think so, but there probably should be. And so I was like, maybe you want to help me kind of come up with an idea for how we could accommodate this. And so she had some ideas, and this other friend of mine that I've interviewed, Andy M on YouTube, he and I were talking about formatting a website, and I was like, okay, well, I've done that before. I'll start a website, and you can check it and make sure that I have everything in there that should be, and be my point man. So we all kind of got together, and I got some other friends to help me moderate the site. So it's really a team. I mean, I represent a team of people that operate the website. Even though I set it up, but so that's kind of how that.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I really would have loved to just pass it off to somebody else, because I'm I'm next, right? I don't need another thing. But then it's well, we asked around and nobody wanted to do it, and so I was like, I just really feel like this needs to happen, and so it happened. And we have about 200 site members now, and people have really appreciated it. There's a lot of posts on the forum. We've got a groups page. I just put up an events page because now we do monthly live video conferences where we have discussions about different topics. And that's been really great for people to be able to see each other. And, since we're all spread out all over, we can't really get together physically. Although I do encourage people to connect locally on the site. Are you in Idaho? I'm in Idaho. Yeah, get together, because people don't know who is close to them, and they're actually doing that through the site. So that's really good. And there's just so many great people that we've met, and it's been really filling a need, and has also, helped me meet more people who wanted to share their stories. And I've been really blessed by it, and I know other people are excited about it too. So that's how that came about. And then as far as reaction to that, that was funny. When I put up the website announcement video on my channel, this SSPX resistance site found it, and they were just all over it. It was so funny. They went on for pages about, why do you think she's doing this? How much money do you think she's making? I think she looks like a Jew, and all these things. It just cracked me up. It was hilarious.
Okay, so I remember I think I remember your video where you were like, look, I'm not funded by the Vatican. It's like, I wish the Vatican was funding what I'm doing. It would probably be a good investment for them, but
I know.
no.
And I've heard other, like
George
YouTubers say,
Soros.
oh, don't listen to these pro-Pope people. They're making so much money off of their fear propaganda, trying to scare you away from the SSPX and these other groups. And I'm like, who's making money from this? I'm just like, I think that's funny. Anyway, I don't do it for the money. And if I did, I'd be, starving. So, yeah. And you too, I'm sure. I mean, yeah, it's like, you don't do something like this because you want to make money, because what we do is so middle of the road. We are the most unpopular people, I think, in the Catholic world, because it's like, you're not woke and left and anything goes, and you're not, that just add water Catholic, just be trad and you'll be safe. It's like, no, that's not enough. We've got to grow into this more mature, full experience of Catholic life, and you got to deal with all the things. You got to fight the battles and take the knocks, and you've got to push yourself into things you're not comfortable with and deal with it. I mean, that's another trend I'm seeing. And I think that's just, it's part of what some people have to do for their own healing and stuff, avoiding triggers and things, but like this sort of exodus into Eastern Rite Catholicism. And the Eastern rites are beautiful. And, it's all ours, all that wonderful tradition. And so I don't think that's a bad thing to be acquainted with that. But what I don't ever encourage people to jump ship to the Eastern Rite because they don't want to deal with the issues they have with the Roman Rite. I'm like, I think God is calling you to stay put and figure this out, because he made you a Roman Rite Catholic. Like, yes, you can switch rites. Oh, I mean, do what the Holy Spirit is telling you to do.
Well, but and I've heard that's cases, also happening with the ordinariates too, is a lot of people are, theoretically it's for people with, Episcopalian or Anglican patrimony, but it's instead a lot of these parishes are being taken over. Well, unfortunately, some of them are being taken over by traditionalists who don't like the local, who don't like the Novus Ordo, and they just, and sort of they set up shop there, and it's
go for its own sake. Don't go because you're escaping something you'd rather not deal with, or because you're protesting what you don't like, because that would happen locally if we had like a visiting priest who had to do the Latin Mass in English. Then so many of those people that regularly went to that Mass would go to our Eastern Rite Mass down the road. And that priest was getting really frustrated because he's like, that's not why I'm here. I'm not here to, baby you, basically. And so it was just kind of like, I mean, you got to do what you got to do. And if you're just so triggered by an English versus Populum Novus Ordo, you have to take yourself gently through that process and don't push too hard. Because the important thing is to be in the church and appreciate the whole patrimony. But I do think that it is the hardest position to understand when you're like pro Novus Ordo. You're like, the church gave us this liturgy for a reason. We need to help make it what it was supposed to be, and the church would be completely fed. I'm 100% convinced. And most people, if it was done as it was intended to be done by the Vatican Fathers, most people wouldn't even know the difference between that and a 1962. Or they might notice a little bit, but it wouldn't be disconcerting. It would be very organic. Yeah. And I have to say, you made a point earlier about like painting a picture versus like a living thing, like the church is a living thing that grows and keeps going. And that is kind of scary and uncomfortable, because if you can just take a snapshot or paint a picture of the church at one time and it looks very safe and you're like, this was good, let's just go here and keep this. And that's a big temptation of trads, because they feel like they can point to that thing and find safety in it, but they're looking for something you can't really have. Not if you are really going to be a Catholic living in this world. God put you in this time, in this place for a reason, not back then, not in the 1500s when the Council of Trent happened.
Now, I have a bad habit of watching, I don't know if it's a bad habit, but of watching YouTube videos that are people's spiritual journeys, whether sometimes it's, I escaped from a cult, or, I used to be a fundamentalist and now I'm, something else, or ex-Mormon or something like that. And I find that in a lot of these cases, the spiritual journey often leads, like I've heard something like 85% of ex-Mormons have no faith. Like they leave, and they use the term high demand religion a lot. I think in a lot of traditionalist communities, high demand religion is what they're practicing, but then there is the wider Catholic Church. And one of the things that your podcast has demonstrated is that a lot of people who are part of the radical traditionalist movement can find a soft landing in the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church that they maybe didn't experience growing
Right.
up.
Right.
But on the other hand, you hear about a lot of them where their siblings leave religion altogether, or stay in, or or they remain or become even more radical in their traditionalism.
Right.
I mean, these are interesting dynamics that happen in families, that happen in communities. What have you learned about this culture?
High demand, that's a good word to put on it, because people don't go trad because they want an easy way out.
Mhm.
I mean, because it's very demanding and rigorous, and that's one of the things that makes you feel very like sure that you're doing the best thing, because it's so hard. And you're like, I'm not cutting myself any slack, and I'm not cutting anybody else any slack, because that's not what this is about. So it's very stringent and strict, and people want to be very like professional about it, which it's good to be very all in on your faith, but where that ends up going is it gets really Jansenistically tainted, where it's kind of like God is this very severe figure who is basically waiting to catch you in sin so he can smite you. And so you're afraid of that all the time. You get very, very scrupulous. Everything is about the rules and black and white thinking. Like gray area, it's kind of like, don't make me laugh. Gray area,
Mhm.
like everything could be reduced to black and white, or pretty much everything,
Yeah,
they would like it to be. Okay, so because it's a lot more tidy, you feel safe, and you just don't have to discern, because you're just like, oh, is it A or B? And then you just make a decision. So I called it binky Catholicism in the past, because it's kind of like you're just being spoon fed, and you're like,
yeah,
oh yeah, that's it. I don't want to have to work any harder. Like I'm already trying to do this so well. I don't want to put my effort in that way. But then, yeah, you get so parents very much in fear of hell and in fear of not doing everything they possibly can for their kids. So they tend to a lot of families experience physical abuse, psychological, emotional abuse, because it'll be like the dad goes to discipline the kids and he's like, I have to do this or you're going to go to hell and I'm going to go to hell, and then he proceeds to beat them, and it's like, oh yes, how many times I hear stories like that, and it's like, obviously he feels like that's what he has to do, and the kids understand in their intellect, dad's doing this because he thinks he has to do it. So but it's very damaging, and it makes them, that's their image of God the Father,
yeah,
is their father. And if their mother is emotionally manipulative or very critical and stuff, that's their image of the Blessed Mother. So I've also heard people talking about how they had to sort of take a break from certain spiritual practices or things for a while in their adulthood, and then they were able to come back to it later and like heal that relationship with Our Lady or God the Father, because it was like, it's like literally PTSD and triggers that, like even sometimes with the rosary, because that's really drilled. You got to pray the rosary or you're a bad Catholic, or it's almost a sin if you don't do the rosary every day. And it's like, the rosary is amazing. But when you've been raised with these kind of ideas, and it's just so militant, it's like, I don't think Our Lady meant it to be a chain around your neck. I think she meant it to be a blessing and a gift. And so when that's your experience, sometimes you need to take a little break and then come back to it later if you can, or find another way of being devoted to her. And so, yeah, those are some things that I've seen. Obviously, there are definitely some issues with sexual repression and then abuse that comes out of that because of the intense purity culture that exists in these circles. And, the clergy's affected too, and that's caused a lot of harm. There's been some news coverage of that, but there's a lot
yeah,
more that goes on that has not been covered. People would be totally shocked if they knew how common in every trad circle that kind of stuff is. But it's the natural following of kind of stuffing it and not dealing with certain things, and not moving with the progression and development of the church in her theology, the resources she's made available, things to help mitigate stuff like this that we've had problems with. And so you can see in these groups that sort of pulled back from progress with the church, they're having these aberrations that the rest of the church isn't struggling with as much. Although obviously there's abusive situations all over the place, but yeah, that's a really hard theme. And so it happens, spiritual abuse in the church, because of how the fear and the shame and the guilt are being drilled into you. Everybody's got to be perfect. Parish missions every year about hell and the four last things. And it's like that's all you can talk about at a parish mission is those things. And it's like, yeah, they're important, but there's just so much justice and then mercy and and making allowances for people for their weakness or whatever their conditions is really poo-pooed, because it's like you're caving in. Oh, well, you don't want to be a sissified Catholic, and so we don't need that stuff. But it's like, oh, actually, the church in her wisdom has seen what goes on in the world and what people today are dealing with. And so she's dialed back on some of the requirements she's made of people to help them to meet their obligations easier. And they can go above and beyond that. The church isn't saying you can't do more, but she's not requiring as much because it's mercy. But that is like a bad word in Tradland. Because
well, and I think even someone in your position or in my position, raised Catholic, followed the rules, well catechized, and it took me a little while, a little bit of maturity to actually like look out at the wider world and to appreciate that I was actually taught about chastity, not to drink or do drugs, and like those kinds of things. And I, at certain points, I would have a resentment or have almost a jealousy about kids who did that and didn't feel any guilt about it, or you know what I mean, like that kind of thing. And it was a chapter in Jesus of Nazareth, part 1, about the prodigal son, and he said it should really be called the parable of the elder brother. And he explained how the older brother, what was really behind his jealousy or his anger at his little brother was that his little brother went and did the things that he really deep down wanted to do. And Whoa. I mean, this is Pope Benedict type of stuff, and I was like, wait a minute. And in my own journey, I started going to daily mass when I was working at the Bishops' Conference. We had noon mass in the building. It's like there's no getting out of it. Like with my Catholic guilt, like I was there.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm sitting there day after day at daily mass, and for some reason I don't even know what the homily was, but it was the gospel message every single day, loud and clear, was Jesus chastising the Pharisees for griping about how so and so got to do such and such. If that, and I was like, why is Jesus yelling at me? And so I started to realize, like, wait a minute, like most people don't get this Catholic formation that I had. Most people aren't raised with certain values. A lot of people have temptations. Like I know people who, for example, they take their first drink and they're hooked, and fortunately I don't have trouble with alcohol. Fortunately, I'm attracted to women, so I'm able to get married and blah, blah, blah. But like other people have these crosses to bear that lead them to these complicated situations. Who knows what kind of upbringing they have, what kind of abuse they've endured. And so these are people who are still called to and still beloved by God. And I shouldn't resent them, and I feel that resentment is like, once you're in this traditionalist mindset that goes beyond Latin Mass, it's a certain type of outlook that Catholics have, maybe Jansenism, where it's like we've got to judge everyone else rather than like, wait a minute, there, but for the grace of God go I, because if I had been in a different situation, who knows how far I'd need to come to get my life in order. A lot of the people that you've spoken to, obviously they've left traditionalist Catholicism. Do a lot of them, like I know, wonderful interview you had with Sister, who I don't remember her name, but she was the former Sedevacantist nun.
Yeah.
She went
Sister
from
Eucharista. Yeah.
Perfect name for a sister. Sister Eucharista, Sedevacantist nun on Monday, in communion with the church nun on Tuesday. Like she transitioned with members of her community. Others have a more complicated journey.
Yeah.
And I know that you've told some of these stories. Like what lessons have you learned, or what have you learned about human faith or resilience from some of the people you've spoken to?
Wow. I mean, there's a lot of like similar themes, but I did have a quote, somebody that I interviewed, they remarked on they said people don't understand what a heartbreaking, soul-crushing, painful experience it is to break away from traditionalism, but it's all worth it. They all echo that same thing, how excruciatingly difficult it was to make that move, but how worth it was. The amazing peace of soul that flooded them ever after. They never looked back. Like, it requires a lot of strength, and sometimes it takes a long time. Like, it's a really long process. Like, Andy, I had another Andy on recently, another ex-sedevacantist, talking about how it took him like 3 or 4 years of processing and praying and agonizing and just like sweating. Should I leave sedevacantism? And it took his wife like literally one night reading the catechism to come to the same conclusion after he had come out. And he was like, oh my gosh, you're amazing. But it's like, it's just, but also she never got into it as heady as he did. Like, she believed in it, but she had a really simple, strong faith. And so when she was ready and she was presented with the facts, it was like, okay, I can do that. And she was able to walk away immediately. And for him, it was just this long, drawn out thing. It was so painful. But again, it's like God is working out your salvation. Every individual is so different. But I'm just amazed by the strength of these people and their courage, because you don't win points with anybody in that world for doing that. You come under a lot of criticism. Sometimes you completely lose all your family, your friends, your church community, priests that you loved, whatever. Like, they look at you as an apostate. So they're like, we can't talk to you anymore. You're going to infect us with your modernism. So it's very lonely. Not everybody is like that. I mean, some groups are a little more forgiving, but then they won't ask, why did you decide to leave? Because they're afraid that, you could contaminate them with your answer, and they're not supposed to be open to that kind of thing because they're in the right place. So they shouldn't listen to anybody. It's again, that very cultish mindset of like, you stay out there because we have it. We don't need anything else. And you can't be challenged, because that's the difference between like a cult and the church. The church is like, ask questions. We don't draw lines. Come in closer. We'll tell you anything you need to know. But a cult is like, this is what you need to know. The leadership decides. And beyond that, don't ask questions. We will give you everything you need. But then you're very dependent, and you're not safe to go out into the world and to evangelize, to be confronted by things, to let other ideas challenge you, because you're not secure in your faith, because your faith depends on the leadership and everything they told you and all their talking points. And if those fail, you start floundering and you're like, oh no, this is terrible. So either you then consider those ideas you were presented with and leave the cult, or you stay in and just block your ears. So there's just so much psychological conditioning, the family mafia thing, where it's like, we are the patriarch and the matriarch, and you do what we tell you. And if you leave the family, it's just going to be dishonor and disfavor on you as long as you live. Like, maybe we'll keep talking to you, but every opportunity we have, we're going to bring up why we're unhappy with you for doing this. And that is just a lot for people to take. And that can be why they take so long to come out of these things.
That you're talking about sort of that step of bravery, which is, or fortitude. And I think even probably as cradle Catholics, you and I, it's like, sometimes, I don't know, in some moments, it's like, maybe I'm conditioned.
Yeah.
But the good thing is, I'm not afraid of exploring. I'm not afraid of, and the church Vatican II, the church embraced the modern science of history, for example, especially with things like the Bible. Everybody who leaves a high demand religion is like, that little teensy bit of doubt that they have is, I'm going to hell if I'm wrong, or if I'm not doing the right thing. If this step isn't right, that means. And so, I mean, it's got to be terrifying to build up to. Now, some people probably reach the point where, well, it's like, I'm done, I'm out of here, like, whatever, but other people, especially people who have just, who maybe benefited a lot from the community, but can't handle it any longer. It's like, that's a huge step.
It is. And also, that conditioning of we're right and nobody else is right. And so if you leave, you're going to hell. But then there's so much fear, like these stories that will be preached from the pulpit about the terrible, nightmarish things that will happen to people if they commit this particular sin or whatever, and literally giving the kids nightmares, so you grow up just imbibing that. And then it's like, and they tell you, you'll never be good enough. Like, you're always on the edge of just falling into hell because it's so easy to do. And God, like, he wants you in heaven technically, but but not if you're not trying hard enough. So you get to the point of being like, either this is just too much, like too strict, and there's got to be more mercy somewhere. And those people are willing to look at the wider church then, be like, is this everything Catholicism is? But then there's the people that are like, I'm going to hell anyway. Even if I stay and kill myself trying, I am still going to hell because there is no hope for me. Like sometimes people will even tell them. This one lady I know, when she was growing up, her parents were upset because she was kind of pushing the modesty standards that they'd set, and they were kind of bickering about it, and they took her to the priest to talk to her. And they're like, talk to our daughter, fix her wagon, basically. Yeah. And he just looked at her and he said, oh, I am not going to waste my time. She's going to grow up to be a whore and have a child out of wedlock. Okay. They literally said that to her and her parents. So you're like, well, thanks. I guess there's no point in sticking around. If you have still a desire for religion and you manage to make it back into the church, God be praised. But what I hear is that most people that leave traditionalism don't end up back in the church. They end up complete atheists or agnostics, hedonistic lifestyles, drugs, alcohol, sex, everything, suicide, like so much despair because they're like, there's no point. And because their cult conditioning was so strong, they're like, everything else is ruined for them. There's nowhere to go for religion besides that little group you left because they weren't like, you couldn't handle it anymore. So you had to leave, but they still convinced you that nowhere else was true or safe or good to go. So they've basically destroyed your spiritual life forever.
Yeah.
And that is one of the worst things about it. And I don't use the word cult lightly. Literally everybody that I have interviewed has told me on video or off that their experience was cultish, that they lived in a cult, that traditionalism, even in the groups within the church, it had those elements. And we have a video and one of our site members wrote a paper, did a survey and wrote a paper about, is the SSPX a cult? And you could just take a lot of that and apply it on a set of conscious groups too. And it's very interesting, away from all the moral and the theological principles of what makes them different from the rest of Catholics. It's like that aside, what behavioral characteristics do they show? What patterns and messages do they teach that make them this? And it's not healthy, just on a psychological and emotional level. It's not normal. It's not good.
Yeah, I actually watched that one. He used Stephen Hassan's bite model for what makes a cult. And actually, the funny thing is, as disappointing as it can be to be like in the mainstream church and see people fall away that you grew up with, or maybe some laxity or heterodoxy, or it's like nobody is forcing them. It's not,
right.
The wider church is not a cult. The wider church doesn't fit that description. We have a pope that half the people don't listen to, and nobody, I mean, even though he does, I mean, you read Pastor Eternus and you might kind of get that idea, but it's a yes, rather than you'd better do this or not. It's that whole proselytism or coercion versus faith growing by attraction. And that is a model, that's the only model for, I think, for the Catholic Church in the modern world, which was the purpose of Vatican II. How can we speak to people today in a way that is actually relatable? And a lot of that is speaking about the joy of the gospel, speaking about unconditional love, like the idea of being unconditionally loved by a God, no matter how you are, no matter what you do, no matter who you are, no matter how much you've screwed up in the past, to have, and that goes back to the mother-father models. It's like you have somebody, and you have the Blessed Mother who love you unconditionally, who you can be with, who are right beside you no matter what. And I think that angle, that's the void, I think, that's missing in the wider culture. It's, we have all this freedom, we have all these things, we have all the video games or whatever, that we want, but there's still an emptiness, and God fills that void and turns us hopefully on fire with love, with God's love.
Yes.
So
love versus fear. That's really what it boils down to. And that the existence of traditionalism is a reaction. Basically, it's a reaction to something that they are afraid of or that they disliked for different reasons. So it's based on negative principles. It's like a negative premise, which isn't really sustainable. Whereas the faith itself and seeking communion with God for which you were created, and like that is the focus of Catholicism.
Yeah.
Like,
And communion with everyone else. It's the
yes,
universal
communion with
church.
your family, the church, and it's a family. It's not just like this hunker down group that has to exist to protest other things that shouldn't be happening. And that is like, you have to constantly drill your talking points and why we exist, why what we're doing is so important, contrary to what they're doing. And so you have to spend so much time with that conditioning and reminders that you are not spending enough time cultivating the love of God, the love of neighbor, and learning to seek God and to be closer to him, because you've got to be so concerned with the issues. You have to be in a perpetual state of alert, and heresy could come at me at any moment. I got to be ready for it. What's going on in the world, and it really sucks you dry, because we don't have that kind of stamina. Our souls can't stand up to that. They weren't made to be like that. We were made to be filled with love, and not to be like the police of the church all the time. I'm sorry, maybe that sounds hippie, but it's like, I don't think that was my idea. I think that,
and this is something that Pope Francis said. He was the first one to say it when I noticed it. Benedict and John Paul said the exact same thing, and so did Paul VI, which was the evangelization starts with the proclamation of the kerygma, preaching the message of the gospel. Christ died and rose for our sins and for our salvation. And it's like, and I was on another podcast recently. It's like, I don't think leading with our teaching on contraception is necessarily the first talking point you want to do when evangelizing your atheist neighbor. It's a beautiful teaching, and if you embrace it, it can enrich your life. But it's like, that is so far from people's minds. But it's like, if somebody's like, well, why are you so happy? Or, hey, I met your friend that was over at your house as they were leaving yesterday, and they were really nice. Where did you meet? Like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's where does your joy come from? Where do you find meaning in life? What brings you peace? Wow, you're doing a lot of good in the world. It's amazing that, but it's like when we start with when our fix, and I don't want to, they are important issues, but it's like these moral doctrines they're not like, they are, I don't want to say for like an advanced faith, but I think that it's, for somebody who's coming from the outside, these aren't the first principles. They're
right.
It's, nobody's going to follow Humanae Vitae unless they want to.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? It's like, unless you want to do God's will and you believe that it is God's will to, to live a certain type way in your married life, then that's when you're going to do it. It's not
right.
It's
well,
not
the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. When you have the spirit, you don't need the letter.
Exactly.
Because you're living it. It's just coming out of you. You're living according to God's design. So, and we don't live in an age where you can really pressure people socially anymore to follow certain norms that are, morally right or customary, because those norms have been very much broken to a great extent. So the whole like fire and brimstone things, like scaring people into being good, or being like, did you know if you do that you're going to hell? It's like, people be like, hell, I don't even believe in hell. Tell me something that speaks to me. And speaking about somebody who made you out of love, redeemed you out of love, and is waiting to love you for all eternity. And it's like, and that will transform your life, and you will be full of joy and peace, and like, it will flow to everything you do. It will bless everybody you know. It's like, okay, well, if I have to do certain things to realize that in my life, so what? Like, I want that, and I see it in you, and I want that. And so you're right. That's absolutely right. I mean, I had neighbors growing up that were Protestant, and finally one day we started kind of, talking over the fence, and this priest was doing a parish mission at our church, and he was like, hey, I want you to go home and invite somebody that you know to the parish mission and bring them. And I thought of our neighbors, and I was like, oh, okay, I'll talk to them, because I know they like read the Bible and stuff. But so I asked, and they were just like, yeah, we'd love to go to your church for the mission. And so they came, and they were just like, wow. And they just really liked our family, and they met a bunch of people at church. So they really liked, but they were sitting there, for an hour and a half for these mission talks night after night in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. Yeah. And I was wearing a veil, and my neighbor friend was like, oh, I think I'm going to cover my head too. And I'm like, I mean, you don't have to unless you want to. You're not even Catholic. But she's like, yeah. I just want to do it. And so she didn't ever need an explanation of why some women want a veil in church. She just felt it when she walked in there. And she always did until she died. So she died in a car accident several years later. But she and her husband did come into the church, and they were just such an inspiration. Their faith was just so strong and simple. And some people actually had invited them to the Society Chapel because they'd met some people that I knew that went there, and they were like, oh, you should come check it out. And they asked me, well, what is that? Like, why don't you go there? And so we had like this one little conversation about it, and they were like, you know what? That doesn't sound like anything we need to be bothered about. And they just happily went to mass in the diocesan church, and they were just so full of joy. And they I remember walking up to the Easter Vigil with them, that when they were coming in, they said, this is the day I've been waiting for my whole life. And it was just oozing out of them. And I was like, I did not, we had conversations about what does the church teach about this and that. But for them, it was like, it just made sense. They were with Jesus, and they knew they were loved, and they were just like captivated by it. They didn't have to be drilled with all this stuff. Like you said, most people aren't going out there looking for every legislative argument that's going to change their minds about things. And I so appreciate having those resources like you guys, you and the Logos Project and Michael Lofton. Like, I listen to your stuff. And I think that it's really informative and helpful, just because we need to know the reasons why we do what we do and be able to explain that to other people who need that. But fundamentally, it's God moving in you, drawing you to himself, and whether you respond to that or not, and who is there to help you respond to that.
Yeah. And before we close, because we're kind of going a little long, but no, it's good. No, I mean, I'm here all day, but I don't want your kids to, and I love it when your kids show up in your videos, like the camera disappears and then reappears and there's some kid climbing all over you. But anyway, one of the things that I have kind of learned to do, because this proselytism and like you said, apologetics has its place, but a true conversion is different than winning an intellectual argument. And so one practice that I learned from a priest, it's like, well, where do you find that happy medium of, do I bash someone over the head with the doctrine thing, or do I leave them to their own devices? And a prayer that I recommend, pray that you play the role in this person's conversion that God is calling you to play.
Oh,
you're being an instrument. Allow yourself to be an instrument rather than try to drive the bus. Whatever we can do to touch other people and bring Jesus Christ into people's lives is beneficial beyond what we can understand and what we can see.
Right. Well, it makes me think of a quote by Mother Teresa about that she's criticized by some traditionalists for this, because somebody asked her one time about, what must I do to be a good person? And she's like, well, if you're a Christian, you need to be a good Christian. If you're a Muslim, you need to be a good Muslim. Like, you do what you know is right. You do the best as you know it, and try your hardest, and that is what God asks of you. And people criticize her, like, she's telling everybody they can just be whatever and still go to heaven, and like everything's the same. It's like, no, you're talking to somebody who baptized like 30,000 people in her lifetime, because she loved so much. And when they were dying, and they'd say, I just want to have what you have. I want to know Jesus that makes you the way you are. And she's like, do you want to be baptized? They're like, yes. And so she baptized. It's like, are you kidding? Like, that was not what she was about. She was such a great example of that.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. So just to wrap up, looking ahead, what do you see for tradrecovery.com and for the Misshappycatholic channel and for this apostolate? And is there anything that you're interested in plugging or sharing or inviting people to?
Oh, well, I just see it growing more as time goes on, and I'll continue with my interviews and videos, and hopefully just keep growing the base at the website so more and more people can chip in, help each other, and support one another. And that's already happening. It's beautiful. And very, very much overwhelmingly positive feedback on all those things. Like, we talked about the trolls, but most people are just grateful, and they're encountering these ideas with a goodwill. And so I just want to see more of that. And yeah, we're doing the monthly live video conferences at the website, but I also think that eventually we're going to probably do like an ex-traditionalist conference, hopefully, so we can all get together in person. And that would be amazing if that could be an annual thing. So I'm working on some ideas and things for that. But if anybody watching this has experience with planning and putting on conferences and wants to get in touch with me and help me, because I don't. So yeah, I mean, we can all DIY, but we can also go up and smoke. And so that would be amazing. But yeah, that's something I've been praying about, because it would be like a family reunion for these people to get together and meet. And also for the apologists, like the guys on the Logos Project and you and John Salza and those guys, to be able to meet so many people that they have personally helped because of their teaching and content. And I just think it would do so much good and get people's ideas flowing and more positive works and resources coming out of that. I'm just sure of it. So I think that's something really to put energy into next. So I'm just praying about that.
Well, you heard her, everyone. So be sure to. So if any of you have experience setting up conferences, get in contact with Laura through tradrecovery.com. Please subscribe to her channel, Misshappycatholic. If you type it into your search bar, she'll show up, and subscribe and check out some of her interviews and some of her music and some of her reading of documents, if you like listening to books on tape. So please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and God bless and take care.
Thank you, Mike. God bless you too.